Hello everybody and welcome to today's Dead by Daylight Tyde Talk on the Nurse. As we progress through the Dark Times story, we will eventually bump into one of the most controversial killers of Dead by Daylight. Being the first DLC for the game, Nurse has made massive waves in terms of balance and questions to whether or not killers should have similar strength. Let's begin today by exploring the history and meta of the Nurse from her release to today's most recent patch of 2.7.0. Nurse released in patch 1.1.0 just 2 months into the game's release. This patch would be labeled Chapter 1, The Last Breath. This patch would be significant as it would establish how a typical chapter should release for future installments of the game. It would include a killer, survivor, map, and additional lore. This would also be the first free DLC killer of the franchise, as the developers were committed to allowing the players to have access to anything they could make for free. Nurse would release with a very unique power and be the first killer to introduce an altered movement speed. The 3 original killers all maintained a standard 115% running speed, but the Nurse would be the first to sport a slower movement. I can't confirm exactly what speed she was at, as there is no source that has it recorded. Not the wiki, not the dev notes, or any other YouTuber I could find. If you know what the speed was and you have proof, please post it down below and I will likely pin your comment. She was, however, confirmed to move faster than any survivor, making me estimate she was between 105 to 110% movement speed. This would be accompanied with Spencer's last breath power, giving Nurse the 3 chain blinks at default. If you already see some differences from today's version of the Nurse, you'll notice that she was actually far more powerful than the version we know today. Nurse had the potential to chase survivors without using her power, and also had that power in her pocket in case she had to go through windows or pallets, interrupting any defense a survivor had. Not only that, but the Nurse had 3 blinks at base, along with a locking lunge animation. To explain the locking lunge animation, you could think of it like the difference between a quick attack and a lunge attack of a killer, except you would combine the best of both effects into a single attack. Quick, basic attacks from a killer would guarantee the hit if the survivor's hurt box is detected in the killer's hitbox. Then the animation of the swing would play out and try to show that the killer strike the survivor by moving the camera along to the survivor. Many people may refer to this as auto-aim, but it's just the animation trying to confirm the hit and make it look as close as possible. With the lunge attack of a killer, it could potentially miss, which would bring the reason why people would call the attacks auto-aim. The Nurse's blink would allow her to lunge and could confirm the hit for as long as the survivor's hurt box was in the hitbox of the lunge or blink. This would cause the Nurse to hover over the survivors, as she would not complete the animation of attack until the lunge was fully completed. This would at times give the Nurse the haunting image of hovering over a survivor until the hit landed. Once the Nurse was in this animation, the survivor was going to take damage no matter what. Even if you dropped a pallet in between the two of you and she was stuck on the other side, she would still hit you. And due to this, it seemed a bit unfair and you felt cheated if you thought you got away from the Nurse. The Nurse landing so many attacks so easily became a problem and a major complaint from several survivors. On a personal note, you might even find that I used to defend the Nurse a long time ago, saying that she was not overpowered, and this was due to the fact that her blinks were not nearly as accurate as they are today. Nurse did struggle to blink around and in buildings, and even some entire sections of maps would just completely negate the blink, making it very possible to infinite loop the Nurse on these sections, and once you learned what they were, it was very easy to abuse. This would be a recurring theme for the Nurse blinks through several patches to come and wouldn't be fixed for quite some time. During this time though, it was the Dark Times, and survivors were reigning supreme with infinite loops. For killers, the Nurse was an answer, and she answered hard. No more could a survivor loop any single window or pallet. Now they had to cower in fear if caught in the open against a Nurse. It wouldn't be just her power that brought a shift into the meta, but her perk, Nurse's Calling, would be established as one of the best perks for killers at the time. It was the most desired perk to fend off the overly altruistic Survive with Friends. Now the survivors had to worry about how they healed in order not to get caught out. A month later in September, we were greeted with several fantastic changes to the game, and one of the most important balance changes during the time. The nurse would be hit hard with the nerf hammer in patch 1.1.2, which would introduce a variety of changes to tone down the nurse's overwhelming strength, starting with a reduction in movement speed. Now the nurse moves slower than a survivor, and her only method to catch up was by using her power. This forced nurse players to utilize a movement with penalty. Her blinks were considered to be too forgiving at base, and were then reduced down to 2 blinks. Additionally, they introduced a weakness to the power. Flashlights now had the capability to stun the nurse during a charge or chain blink, providing a stun similar to the Wraith's light burn. Finally, Nurse's Calling perk would be hit with a reduction range to give it a bit of counterplay, as it was slightly larger than the terror radius. They now reduced it to be slightly lower than the terror radius to give survivors time to stop healing. Overall, the changes didn't affect Nurse that much. Her strength still remained, however it did require more skill to play the Nurse, as blinks were no longer as forgiving, and her movement speed did not allow you to play her like any other killer. According to the developer's stats, Nurse was suffering in terms of kills, as a lot of players were not able to kill survivors nearly as much as other killers could. In comparison to how many survivors would live, Nurse on average let 4 survivors escape more than they could kill 4 of them. This gave developers an impression that there was counterplay, while the community will come to find that there were other reasons why the Nurse wasn't performing nearly as well as she could have been. Once the new Halloween chapter hit, releasing the map Lambkin Lane on Haddonfield, it would introduce several 2-story buildings on different levels, which were clearly not designed with the nurse's power in mind. This would be the addition to the game that allowed players to experience just how broken the nurse was in terms of her power just not working. Though the nurse's power was, and is, a threat, when the power itself doesn't work, you've got a killer that legitimately can't even catch up to a running survivor. The power itself would constantly fail to blink into buildings and around them. Once you tried to make a blink, you'd simply stay still as the animation played, then suffer the fatigue. This became a massive issue for nurse players, since Lambkin Lane was not the only map where these issues occurred. These map issues with the blink were not the only trouble the nurse was facing. Due to the reduced movement speed from patch 1.1.2, we'd actually see that reduction also affected her while she was carrying survivors. Now her movement speed was even slower, making it difficult to travel in order to hook a survivor. In order to do this, typically she'd have to run Iron Will or Agitation. Otherwise, she'd have to resort to slugging, which was a popular fad at the time due to the increasing amount of decisive strikes coming their way with the recent release of Lori. Thankfully, early in December, we would be greeted with patch 1.3.0 that would fix the nurse's carrying speed and allow her to travel at the same speed of other killers while carrying survivors to the hook. This would also be one of the first patches to introduce several fixes to the nurse's blink, which allowed her to enter some buildings of Lambkin Lane, but it still wasn't a proper fix and wasn't guaranteed to work, but it did allow her to get around slightly better. As time went on, the nurse was still met with mixed feelings. Players could figure that she had the potential to be one of the best killers, but it came at a price. It was always a gamble whether or not she was even playable when it came to certain maps. Optimization was not at its best, and the cornfields were a massive weakness. Not to mention, any maps with structures were still an issue. The problems kept on increasing as more chapters released. Mud and Flesh introduced the Hag and the Pale Rose map, which blinks got even worse. Boats were the nurse's bane, making it near impossible to catch survivors that would travel through them. Sparks of Madness released with the Doctor, introducing the Treatment Theater, which was an inside-only map, and you could only imagine what kind of problems that brought along. It was a long journey of several minor bug fixes to allow the nurse to even blink on several of the maps. Took several months, several patches, and they had to fix every individual location at a time. Her power would also go to be one of the most unstable, as it would come with several game-breaking bugs on a few releases. As an example, patch 1.6.0 was the Huntress chapter, and the nurse would be bugged with a no cooldown blink attack. If she hit a survivor after a blink, she would not fatigue, allowing her to strike again. It would be hotfixed in a few days. There were a few other infamous bugs, such as the basement blink. If she ever tried to blink past the basement, she would instead blink into the basement, and she could not blink out, requiring her to walk back up. This would immediately cause her to lose chase, and that would also be fixed in a month or so. Another infamous bug was the double fatigue. After a successful blink, the nurse would wipe her blade, then fatigue, instead of successful attack into a fatigue. This caused a lot of issues for the nurse, as it made it almost impossible to play the nurse since you're just spending so much time wiping blades and fatiguing. Survivors could typically escape you after you land an attack. Though the power was unstable for several patches, one of the most important changes came in patch 1.9.0 in January of 2018. Nurse would have her blink attack adjusted. No longer would hit detection be immediate from the blink, but instead would act like a normal lunge, giving it a larger possibility to miss, but also giving more control and range. The blink speed would also see a couple of tweaks, but more importantly, her blinks will now have been reworked. Blinks would now work based on the direction Nurse was looking, not only on a horizontal scale, but a vertical scale. She could adjust not only going into different levels, but how far a fully charged blink could go. Originally, for Nurse, if she had fully charged her blink, she was going to move the max distance, and the only way to counter it was to blink into an unblinkable location to keep yourself nearby. This was very difficult for Nurse to do, depending on the situation. A massive counter to the old blink for a survivor was to just run up to the nurse if you saw she had her blink charged. She would have no way of canceling this, and she would have to commit to the blink, and it was a painful moment for most nurse players. This new form of blinking gave Nurse a whole new way to control how she traveled, along with fixing majority of the issues she had with the maps. Though her power would seemingly perform the same feats, it's the fact that the players could now control the distance and precision, making her even more deadly than she was before. No longer was Nurse a gamble at doing well based on the map, but now it was all up to the player's skill to wipe the survivors out. Though this blink would reform how the nurse could control her blinks, it wasn't perfect, and some of the newer maps still needed fixing along the way, so we still saw minor fixes about every month or so here to fix the very specific locations the nurse could not blink through. They also introduced pallet stuns to the nurse during her blinks, as she used to be able to ignore most of the effects. However, now she could be stunned mid-blink. And that would bring us up to speed for where we have the nurse today. Not too many changes happened to her since patch 1.9.0, and it's been about a year and a half, and we haven't heard anything about a nerf or a buff or a balance change coming anytime soon. In fact, other killers are getting their reworks as we speak. This brings us to ask the question, where is she in today's meta? And well, she is unanimously agreed upon the strongest killer of Dead by Daylight. The nurse has all the strength a killer needs, which is essentially ignoring anything a survivor can do to effectively stop a killer from approaching them. The nurse's add-ons make her even more threatening, and being able to cover even more of the map in a shorter amount of time. She can be one of the fastest killers to travel across the map, making some of the most meta perks devastating on her. In fact, barbecue and chili is almost unanimously agreed upon the best perk to have for the nurse, as you can combine it with your Omega Blinks and wipe an entire team before a single gen is done. That isn't to say if the Survive with Friends group worked together to rush the generators, they could likely escape a nurse with only a few casualties. Nurse is the only killer to allow dynamic gameplay where the killer changes the flow of the chase. The killer makes the predictions instead of chasing and reacting to what the survivor sets up as a mind game. No other killer will be able to end a chase as fast as the nurse, as she could simply avoid walls, pallets, windows, and utilize almost every perk in the game to her advantage. Now, all of this remains true except for on console, which is a whole story in and of itself, so we'll save that for another video. There are drastic differences to why the nurse is viewed so differently between console and PC, but I'm out of time simply covering the history of the nurse here. So thank you guys for watching this video. It was hard to push out, but I'm thankful for everyone for supporting me this far. If you like this video, feel free to subscribe and hit that notification bell for the next Tyde Talk, as we do have Dark Times Part 3 on the way, and it'll be a good one. We'll see you next time. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and as always, Good game.